go.
You're good.
We're good, Phil.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good to see this nice big crowd. This is a big BSides. This is quite a bit larger than ones we do in Dallas-Fort Worth. BSides dipped up. Everything's supposed to be bigger in Texas, but you guys got to beat. So awesome to be here. Thanks to BSidesPhilly for inviting me to be the keynote. It's an honor to be here, and you know it's going to be a good time when you see Rando. So this presentation was based off of my experience working in a company as a red team lead, and it was kind of interesting because I ended up creating this single slide because people in the organization, you know, when you work in a certain area, sometimes you take for granted and think everyone should understand the area. You're in cybersecurity, you should understand offensive security, but that's not the case. So in the organization, we had people that were, you know, on the blue team, people in project management, different areas within cybersecurity, didn't know the difference between red teaming, pen testing, vulnerability assessments, vulnerability scanning. We had a director there that actually wanted a red teaming operation done against an SAP app. And so I created this single slide that showed the difference between the different types of offensive security assessments, including like vulnerability management and so forth. So we'll actually have that slide in this presentation, but that's where it was, where the inspiration came from. This was originally, I did a talk called Offensive Security Awareness, and then kind of saw the need to show some of the gaps that we see in traditional pen testing and areas to improve. So that is something new to the presentation, but that's kind of the updates to that. So kind of a little bit about my background. I've been in offensive security for over 12 years, cybersecurity for over 20, January will make 21 years, and I was a sysadmin for the first 6 years. And for anyone that's wanting to get into cybersecurity, if you can't get a security job starting out, I recommend something like being a sysadmin. The best experience I had helping me become a pen tester was the time I spent as a sysadmin, because you ever get shelled with a system and you don't understand the operating system, you're going to be doing a lot of Googling and not doing very much. So also, I'm an offensive security instructor and former adjunct instructor. I used to teach at Dallas College. I taught pen testing, web app pen testing there for almost 4 years, and that's really what got me interested in speaking, because I like to share information. And before, I would just share information for anyone that wanted to become OSCP certified, to become a pen tester, and then the opportunity came around in 2018 to be an adjunct instructor at Dallas College. So I had the pleasure of building out that program there, running it for almost 4 years. And during that time, I had a lecture I gave my class on pen testing careers. First time I gave that lecture was in January 2018. By November 2018, I turned it into a conference talk titled The Pen Tester Blueprint. And then later on, made a book out of it, because I saw that this was good information, because there's tons of good books out there on pen testing, but none of them will really show you where to start out, what you needed to know before becoming it, or trained to become a pen tester. And so I'm also a podcaster, so I host the Phillip Wylie Show, previously hosted the Hacker Factory. I went independent last year, so you have to check it out. I have all my guests share their hacker origin story, kind of how they got started. My most recent episode was with Jason Street. Next week is John Hammond. I've got Int 80 from Dual Core coming out in a couple of weeks. And so I'm also part of the Cyber Circus Network. So we're going to be presenting later on today. We're doing a live podcast episode. So I hope you're able to attend that. And so some fun facts about me. So I usually only include this in my career talks, but I figured this would be worth sharing. So before I ever decided to get into IT or any of that, when I graduated high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do for a living. So I was a powerlifter. My friends said, hey, you're a big guy, you should become a pro wrestler. So I went to wrestling school and I wrestled for a couple of years. And this is actually me wrestling, where the picture of the yellow t-shirt, this is me wrestling a 750-pound bear. It was a nightclub I worked at. So working as a pro wrestler, I was lucky to wrestle once a week, and it wasn't enough to make a living. So my main job was working as a bouncer. And the organization, the nightclub I worked at, they had special events on Sundays, because it wasn't worth the expense of paying a band, so they'd have special events like this, and they had Wrestling Bear come in, which was open to anyone to wrestle. And so the other one is at the same nightclub. I didn't have any good, decent resolution pictures from my wrestling days, but this was a match we put on there. But I wrestled in WCW and WCCW, went to wrestling school with The Undertaker. I wrestled the Road Warriors, Midnight Express, Rock and Roll Express, Fabulous Freebirds. So I figured that'd be something fun to share. And one of the reasons I like to share this in career talks is sometimes people don't think they can do certain things. I never thought I'd use my mind for a living. I always thought it would be something physical. And then over the years, I had to find a better career, went to CAD school. That's where I got exposed to computers, got into IT from that as a sysadmin. So just something I like to share with folks, especially the aspiring security professionals, and this is something for if you to help people remember me by. So the agenda, so we're going to do an introduction to offensive security, the different types of offensive security approaches, identifying the gaps in offensive security programs, and strategies for optimizing and overcoming gaps in offensive security. So offensive security is basically assessing the security from a threat actor's perspective. You're always seeing in the news these companies being breached by threat actors, nation states, whatever level of threat actor, but there's no better way to assess your security than from a threat actor perspective. You can run a vulnerability scanner and find vulnerabilities, but in some cases it may be vulnerable to a certain CVE, but maybe there's mitigating controls that would not allow someone to exploit that system. So this is why you want to do a pen test against systems. So you're using different techniques like computer hacking, which is the most understood part of it, or most realized. And then also some physical testing as well as social engineering. A lot of these different ransomware attacks and breaches, people get the foothold in from social engineering. And so offensive security is an important complement to vulnerability management. So this is kind of testing how well your vulnerability management program is working. So after you're doing your vulnerability management programs, but you're not really sure how well it's working. Are any of those vulnerabilities actually exploitable? What can be done past that vulnerability that's exploitable? Can someone exfil data, get access to data? So doing the pen test is a good way to validate your offensive security, your vulnerability management program. So different assessment targets. So this is kind of changing over time. It's computers, networks, hosts, laptops, IoT devices, cloud. A lot of things shifted to cloud. Since I started in pen testing in 2012, there's been a big push to the cloud, and we're seeing a lot of that. So hardware devices, even like some of the medical devices are starting to require that pen tests be done. Because one time, the thing we've got great innovators in the world in our country, but people don't always think about security. So you build these devices, medical devices, and you're not expecting anyone to try to hack into those devices. So now that they're starting to require that, because if you're able to exploit an insulin pump or a pacemaker, you can kill or harm someone. So it's important that these are tested. IoT and ICS, this is becoming very critical because our critical infrastructure, people trying to attack water treatment plants, electrical facilities. So it's very important. Physical security is one area that gets overlooked a lot, and we'll get into some of the gaps and stuff around that area further in this presentation. So different offensive security types. So one of the things that we got listed here, the first one is vulnerability management. It's not truly an offensive security approach or type of test, but it needs to be included because you should have vulnerability management in your program. So the next step is vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, red teaming, also known as adversary emulation. And we'll get into details and show the differences between red teaming and pen testing, because a lot of times there's a lot of overlap. And through this presentation, one of the things to keep in mind is you don't necessarily have to use that same terminology, but it's important if you were going to have a red team operation conducted, make sure that you're on the right page, that you're using the same terminology, because some vendors, there's a lot of vendor products out there that will call it red team. I've seen some bug bounty platforms that refer to their platform or their team as red team, which is truly not. It's really pen testing. But just as long as you know the difference, that's going to be helpful. And that's one of the inspirations to this presentation is you just need to understand enough of this to be able to work with the offensive security teams and understand to help be a better consumer and decide on what type of assessment that you need. So vulnerability management is the cyclical practice of identifying, classifying, prioritizing, remediating, and mitigating vulnerabilities. Vulnerability management is an integral integral to computer security and network security and must not be confused with vulnerability assessment. And we kind of see the steps here. So you're doing the asset inventory and asset discovery. One of the important things that we need to make sure is we have a complete inventory, because if you don't know what you have, you're not able to protect it or assess it. So you need to make sure you've got a good asset inventory. And with shadow IT, this can be a real problem. Back in my sysadmin days, it was a little more difficult to just build infrastructure. You have to bring someone in. It was technical to build a server and install the apps and so on. But now with the cloud, it's easy for people to spin stuff up fairly quickly. Maybe the marketing team needed to spin up some microservices to do some ads for marketing and stuff. So it's really important that we're doing this asset discovery and inventory. Then you do your vulnerability scanning, and then vulnerability remediation, including patching. You want to make sure that you're doing your ongoing patching. As Patch Tuesday comes out, you get these new vulnerabilities. You need to make sure that you're going through patching, and then kind of testing after that to make sure that didn't open up any holes, and then repeat the process. Because traditionally, vulnerability management is what goes on kind of between your pen tests, because a lot of times companies are going to have a budget to do continual pen tests or frequent pen tests. So vulnerability management is something that's kind of in between, that helps you out between pen tests. So vulnerability assessments are kind of similar, although we go a step further. With a vulnerability assessment, we're doing not only vulnerability scanning, we're validating the vulnerabilities to make sure they're not false positives. And this can be done by using a secondary vulnerability scanner, because there's times vulnerability scanners may find something the other one doesn't. I had an example where I was back in one of my consulting jobs. I was doing a pen test for this company. They're using Rapid7 Nexpose, and I found something with Nessus that Rapid7 Nexpose wasn't discovering. And there's cases where it may be the other way around. Some vendors will get the CVEs into their platform sooner than the others. And so just different types of manual discovery and different manual testing tools. Metasploit has a lot of good auxiliary modules you can use to look for vulnerabilities and do discovery with. So using a lot of the different type of tools you use in pen testing, but you're not exploiting. So what you're doing is validating the vulnerabilities. A step you can go a little further to make your vulnerability assessment a little more effective is to see if any of the vulnerabilities are exploitable, but not exploit the vulnerabilities, then to document that in a report. Look up any POCs and list that in your report, so that way they know, and this may be kind of a way to show them that they need to perform a pen test, that a vulnerability assessment wasn't enough. And there's cases when you want to do a vulnerability assessment. I was doing a pen test for a hospital chain, and there's Wi-Fi pen test, and I got in the hospital and I was starting to do my scans, and I was starting to discover medical devices hooked up to the Wi-Fi network in the emergency room and operating rooms. And so it's one of these cases you really don't want to be doing things that could, like running a Nessus vulnerability scanner may not be the best idea, or trying to hack any of these systems. So what I did is I went back to the CISO and we changed up the way we were doing the assessment. So we changed it to a vulnerability assessment, but I did a wireless access point and wireless controller configuration review to look for any vulnerabilities there, combined with a vulnerability assessment to reduce any risk of injury or taking out any kind of critical medical devices. And there's some cases with OT and ICS environments that you may want to do a vulnerability assessment and have to be really careful in your approach. So penetration tests, or pen tests for short, are similar to a vulnerability assessment. How the vulnerability assessment we did, the vulnerability scans, the discovery and all this, validating the vulnerabilities. We're testing to see if they're exploitable, and then we go in and actually exploit the vulnerabilities, see what we can do past that. Are you able to do any kind of post-exploitation? Sometimes, when you're new to pen testing, which I was guilty of, you're more focused on getting domain admin, or root to the system, but your data is your crown jewel, it's your information. Because this is why threat actors are using ransomware to encrypt your data, to be able to find a way to monetize what they're gaining access to. And so you can test data exfiltration is one of the ways to take this a step further. Other post-exploitation methods like lateral movement and privilege escalation. And so the different types of testing, so you mainly hear black box and white box mentioned. Black box is also known as a blind pen test. White box pen test is also referred to as a crystal box or assumed breach. So the black box is more of an attacker approach. This is limited information. And this could vary because really one of the things you want to make sure when you're doing these kind of tests that you have the full scope that you want tested. Because if you lean specifically on a black box test, you're dependent on reconnaissance to discover all these systems that need to be tested, and you're not given a full scope, then there's a good chance they may get missed. So you really want to include that scope. With the white box, you get a little more detailed. So the white box, you've got the fully defined scope. If it's an application, then you've got source code to do static source code analysis against that to thoroughly test it. For an application, you want to test authenticated on every level of access to that system to make sure if you're a user, you can't access information that an administrator can access. And if you're just, if you're an administrator, there's certain information that you don't need to be accessed. So you want to test these different levels. And over the years, something interesting has kind of happened, and what brought this about in infrastructure is doing an assumed breach, doing a pen test with credentials, is the fact that a lot of times pen test companies were going out, they couldn't get that foothold because they didn't have credentials. Maybe it was hard to hack in that system, and they couldn't get a foothold unless they were doing something like social engineering, doing some type of phishing campaign. So a way to overcome that is with credentials, because we have insider threats. So you have cases where KnowBe4 was infiltrated by people from North Korea, and then you see instances where I talked to a company back in 2019 that we got our threat intelligence from, and they were talking about a hardware company where a nation-state implant was within this organization, so they had access to the system. It makes it easier. Some of the stuff that they would want to get intellectual property-wise, everyone may have access to, so they're able to steal this data as a legitimate employee. So the insider threat has always been an issue. I mean, I'm sure some of us in the room that's been around for a while, you've heard the story of the developer that worked at the bank that set the deposit application to take like a fraction of a cent and deposit another account, and then having hundreds of thousands of customers over time, it adds up to a significant amount of money. So insider threats also disgruntled employees. Insider threats also take into consideration ransomware. So what the level of access you have, if you click on a link that has ransomware in it, then whoever the attacker is has that level of access. So it's a lot of reasons to do that. You want to thoroughly test it. Some people that are hardcore hackers think this is cheating, but really you need to thoroughly test your systems, and doing that with an authenticated approach is the way to go. And you can start out with a black box approach, see if you can get a foothold, see if you can hack in, and then if you can't, go to the assumed breach. That way you're thoroughly testing, because like I said before, companies would come in, they couldn't get a foothold, they'd write up the report, and it looked good, the company thought they were secure, but they didn't take in effect insider threats. Then there's also a gray box. This is kind of in the middle. This is typically what more pen tests fall under. You're taking a black box approach that you're trying to hack into it. There's no credentials, but with the gray box, you've got a full scope. It's got all the IPs. That way you're not missing anything out in the scope. And so red teaming. So this one, before we mention share what red teaming is, a pen test, you're looking for all the vulnerabilities that are exploitable and exploit them. With a red team operation, you're not doing that. With a pen test, you're letting people know that the pen test is going on, so that way they see malicious activity or anything gets broken, it can be fixed, it can be addressed. With a red team operation, you have a control group, and it's usually like the CISO, maybe some management. Usually they don't let the blue team in because they really don't want them to realize what's going on, because you're also testing the reaction of your defenders, seeing if they're able to detect the malicious activity, are they able to contain it. And so in red teaming, you're really trying to emulate a APT group using a certain TTP to get into that environment. And so this is a type of method that relies heavily on phishing and social engineering. And like I said, you're going in undetected. One of the best outcomes I've seen from a red team operation is this company had an incident response company on retainer. They were having this red team operation going on. The defenders detect something odd, so they bring in the incident response team, they're investigating. They call the CISO to let them know what's going on, and he let them know this is an authorized activity. But the fact is that they discovered it. They reached out to their consulting company to come in and try to contain and remove the threat. So this is kind of one of the things you do. And you think a lot of times about you're doing disaster recovery exercises and business continuity to see if you're able to, come back from a disaster or any kind of outage or something to be able to recover from that. But when you do red teaming, it's kind of a way to test your incident response plan, of people actually detecting what's going on, and that's really what you want to do. Maybe not all the time the technology can catch it, but if your people can catch it, that's a good thing. And just kind of an example of a pen test I did once was more of adversary emulation, but we got down to the last 8 hours of the pen test. And we came on site to test physical security. We were in a conference room, and we were really down to the point where we really couldn't be quiet anymore. We had to run Nessus vulnerability scanners, responder, and I was able to get a foothold in the environment. I was able to create an account on the system. We gained access to those systems. And we're on site. One of the things while I was there, the guy who was doing the pen test for us was kind of a side hustle that I was doing. So he decides to call his cell phone from one of the telephones to see, the outbound number, so maybe he could do some, social engineering, do some phishing. And so he did that. So they actually later on had a record of this. But the interesting thing was, this was a very educated CISO that the guy could perform pen tests himself. They regularly had CTFs to educate the team. They were going through training. They were, highly skilled, and they had all the software and everything that you would need to secure your environment. But the problem was there's so much noise, they didn't hear anything. We were there, and they didn't detect it until 12 hours later. We were gone 12 hours. As it's been a threat actor, we could have had whatever data, took it and was gone. And one of the main reasons they found us was because when they started looking into the suspicious activity, they found his cell phone number. And the funny thing was, they kind of figured out, because I created a user account under my name, because with pen testing, you want to make it easy to clean up. If you've been a threat actor, you're going to create an account that's not easy to figure out. And so I used Phil, and so he knew that, we're both part of the Dallas-Fort Worth security community, so they figured out it was me. But like I said, it's 12 hours later. So they didn't have those endpoints really tuned in to kind of sort through all the noise. So also too, red teaming is referred to as adversary emulation. So anytime you're trying to get one of these type of tests done, make sure that you're on the same page, because back to that director, he was wanting to get a red team operation done against an SAP app. Really, he wanted a pen test done. So being on the same page, some people use terminology different. So just know to ask, if you're wanting a red team operation done, make sure you're saying adversary emulation. Most consulting companies are going to know what that is, but some other vendors with products really don't know the difference. And so here's the example of that slide that I created that showed the different types of assessments and compared those. So if you see one thing that's common across all those, is your reconnaissance, whereas in your vulnerability management, this is your asset discovery and inventory. So you have to collect information on the targets. The next step is your vulnerability scanning, which you do vulnerability scanning across vulnerability management, vulnerability assessments, and pen tests, pretty similarly running a vulnerability scanner. But when you get into red team operations, you have to do more manual testing to try to go undetected. I mean, there are cases like the one I shared where I was running vulnerability scanner and they didn't know anything was going on, but a lot of cases are going to detect that. And so with the next step is your manual testing and vulnerability assessments. So you're using different manual testing tools to find vulnerabilities that a vulnerability scanner may have missed, and then the vulnerability validation. And then, like I said, you can take that a step further and see if there's any types of POCs for exploitable vulnerabilities and document that in your report. And then pen test, you're taking a step further. So you're doing pretty much everything you did in vulnerability assessment, but now you're trying to exploit those vulnerabilities and then do post-exploitation. And with the red teaming, you're just trying to find, one way in that would be equivalent to a breach. You may find another alternate way to maintain persistence. But with the pen test, you're looking for all the vulnerabilities to be exploited and exploit those. And with the red teaming, you're just looking for one way in. And one of these things too is that with the red team operations, this is something you want to do when your organization's more mature. So after you've been through several cycles of pen test and remediation, that's when you add something like red teaming. And this you're also doing, you're relying more on phishing and social engineering to do your physical assessments there as well. So identifying the gaps, so kind of to share a little history lesson of where we got to all these gaps. So pen testing used to be less restrictive in scope, more full scope pen tests. And really, before any kind of compliance, really companies that really knew security really well were the only ones that were having pen tests done. It wasn't a requirement, so a lot of companies weren't spending money. But then PCI DSS come along, and then for compliance reasons, people started having these pen tests done. People that were previously having these pen tests done needed to focus that budget on PCI because they had to get through all this testing. It was a requirement, so other areas got neglected. Different types of testing got left out, like social engineering and phishing campaigns. And so they left out a lot of areas. So, you can be PCI compliant, even your PCI environment secure, but there's other critical systems and get sensitive data in your environments that have nothing to do with PCI, your intellectual property, PII, PHI, so there's a lot of information that you want to protect, and these were getting overlooked. And the good thing about compliance pen testing, it helped pen testing grow, because a lot of people weren't doing pen tests. It was interesting because when I kind of got started out in pen testing, I would go to some of the different meetups, and when I go to the different meetups and conferences local, there might be only 2 or 3 other pen testers in the room. Now I go, there's a lot of people see the need for it. Organizations are having their own pen test teams, so it's really grown, but it's also addressed some gaps along the way. So another one of the gaps is the frequency. So pen tests are kind of a snapshot of your security posture, also known as a time box test. And so time between tests is kind of opportunities for threat actors. And one of the cases for frequent pen testing was during one of my consulting roles. I was testing this company. Unfortunately, they paid for a retest. So 90 days later, we would come back in and retest the environment. So came back 90 days later, they had, when I did the pen test, they had like a critical, a high, and some mediums. When I came back, did my vulnerability scanning during the initial phases of the pen test, I noticed they remediated the criticals and the highs and the mediums. So the only thing left were the lows that were there from the previous pen test. But one of the things that happened during that 90 days, someone had figured out how to exploit one of those low criticality vulnerabilities. Now, if they hadn't had us come back in and do the pen test, that vulnerability would have been there for another year. So this is one of the reasons you want to do frequent pen testing. And this is one of the cases where, at least having vulnerability management between pen tests, something to do in between. So if they would have just been doing their vulnerability scanning, if they would have done a vulnerability scan, they would see, okay, we got a critical vulnerability now, that's supposed to be exploitable, and they would have known. But a lot of cases, companies would have waited until the next year to do another pen test. And so other limitations are overlooked methods like physical security controls, testing your controls you're building, seeing how people can tailgate to get in. Because someone gets access to your data center or gets access to a laptop that someone's logged into, they've got whatever level of access that person has. So you can have the best endpoint protection, say if you had a hack-proof environment, but I'm really not convinced that exists. But if someone's able to get access to the system that's logged in, they're already in the system, they don't have to worry about getting the foothold. So you need to test your physical security controls. Data centers are really critical. And some of the things to look at too, so if you're a utility company, you have service vehicles, trucks and vans, you don't want anyone to get into those vehicles, or you could have expensive broadband equipment in those. People are stealing copper wire, so maintaining those physical assets and even files, because some companies still have paper files, and making sure that those are controlled securely. And social engineering. So social engineering is really important because you see a lot of the footholds from these breaches are through social engineering. And then also red teaming. This is not being utilized as much. So this is really kind of testing your ability, to detect things from, like a nation state or so forth. You're actually be able to take your efforts a little further. And then SIM breach assessments, which I mentioned earlier, where you're testing the systems with authenticated, and then purple teaming, also known as secure controls validation. This has been one of my favorite new assessment types that's been added. So if you're not familiar, you're taking the red team and the blue team, and they're working together and seeing if they can execute different types of tools, and you're seeing if the endpoint detection systems are detecting, blocking those type of activities, and then you just kind of work through that to get to those systems to be able to identify and block those controls. And also overlooked environments, so wireless, cloud, your IoT environments, ICS environments, IoT cameras. Sometimes these Wi-Fi cameras you don't think about, but you can see sensitive data through there. There could be sensitive data in rooms someone's able to access that, see that through a video camera. And so to overcome these gaps, pen testing frequency, so this is like probably one of the top recommendations. So increase the frequency, implement automation or autonomous pen testing. And so there's some products out there. So the company I work for, Horizon 3, we have an autonomous pen testing product. So you're able to run these pen tests continuously without interaction from a human. And one of the things some of the organizations I worked with, and we always had some level of automation. So you need automation to be able to scale. And the interesting thing is, things like autonomous pen testing, is kind of like the next evolution of pen testing, because at one time we didn't have vulnerability scanners, or we didn't have Metasploit, and you wouldn't think about doing a pen test these days without those tools. And environments are growing, because when I kind of got into pen testing, the scopes weren't as big, but there's just more and more stuff being added, AI environments, IoT devices. So it's really growing, and there's such a vast amount of systems that need to be tested. So you need to use some kind of automation to help continuously test and test more frequently. And implement bug bounties and responsible disclosure programs for your mobile applications, your external web applications and APIs. So this way you've got like a pen test or someone constantly testing your external environment. And one of the beauties about bug bounties is there's people that specialize in certain types of vulnerabilities, and they will set up their automation to continually scan. They'll add different bug bounty domains and stuff in there and let that run, and they'll go back and see what they found and test deeper. So this is a good way to do that. And then responsible disclosure. That way people find bugs in your web app, they can report it directly to you. And so this is a lot better than waiting for, to get exploited, waiting for the next pen test to uncover those vulnerabilities. And one of the things that's pretty nice about when you consider web app pen tests and you look at bug bounties, bug bounty hunters, there's things that they'll find that a web app pen test may not find, because with bug bounties, it's crowdsourced pen testing. So one of the descriptions I like to make, or analogies, is you can compare it to a fisherman. Someone that fishes for sport, if they don't catch anything, they're going to go home and have a steak dinner. But the person that has to hunt or fish to feed themselves, they're not going to eat, so they're going to be better at it. So that's one of the advantages to like bug bounties, is these people don't get paid unless they find something. And then overlooked methods, social engineering, including phishing campaigns. And one of the things that include with phishing campaigns is we have the different products like Know4 and Proofpoint have these phishing campaigns built in. And these are good for building security awareness and education. But one of the things where they miss out is what happens if that link you sent out actually had a payload, and it had malware or ransomware. What would happen there? If you're just using these other programs without a payload, then you're just basically you're just testing the security awareness. And with using a payload, you're able to test ransomware readiness. What are they able to do past that? This is one of these things that you actually want. If no one clicks on it, you want to go through and have someone click on that payload to see what's possible, what can they get to through that. And so this is a good way, through that test, you can see what vulnerabilities, because you can take that fish further through that malware and perform further pen testing. And then you can kind of eliminate any of those threats by remediation and kind of help with ransomware awareness and readiness. And then physical security controls, make sure you're having physical pen tests done. And red team operations, also known as adversary relations. So if your organization is mature, start adding that, and then purple teaming to do security controls validation. Doing your security controls validation and vulnerability management between pen tests is a good way to kind of help. The optimal is continuous pen testing, but these are ways to help out in between. And also overlooked environments, wireless, cloud, IoT, ICS environments, make sure you're testing these environments. And that concludes my presentation. If we have time for questions, I'd be happy to answer questions, and please feel free to connect with me on social media. This QR code has my link tree to all of my URLs, so if you don't want to just take a picture of the screen with the URLs and stuff. And also check out my podcast, also the Cyber Circus Network, which will be doing our live podcast episode later today. Good? Yep. Thanks, everyone. And if you have any questions, I'll be around today, so.
Good job, Phil.